بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على خاتم الأنبياء وسيد المرسلين نبينا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. To start this particular discussion, I'm going to be sort of just reviewing a few slides on PowerPoint. This is just kind of give me sort of like an outline of just initial presentation on the issue of Maliki Fiqh. I figured it made sense to start with a particular quote that I've taken from Shaykh al-Munawi in his Fayd al-Qadir, which really emphasizes the importance of the study of fiqh. And the translation of the statement, he says, Ibn Arabi said, dialectical theology, or ilm al-kalam, in spite of its nobility, is unnecessary for most people. Rather, for one person in a town to learn it is sufficient. But that is not the case with respect to matters of jurisprudence. People need a multitude of scholars of the sacred law. And were a man to die not knowing the nomenclature of dialectics, like the meaning of the atom, the accident, the body and what is of an embodied nature, the soul and what is of a spirited nature, Allah will not ask him about any of that. He will only ask people about what was his obligation to do that relate to matters of jurisprudence, practice, and similar things. Basically, beginning that with that statement is just to highlight that though many different topics interest us, no particular topic is more important than the regular ibadats or acts of worship on a daily basis. And that being the case, and Allah expects us to carry these things out, then we still are expected to carry them out, but at the same time to carry them out according to a valid interpretation. A valid interpretation of, for instance, the prayer itself, or how we pay our zakat, or we perform the hajj and things like that. And the different schools have preserved for us different alternative or valid interpretations of the Quran and Sunnah, that we simply can choose one and take that and have relative trust that what we're doing is actually something valid, and we don't have to be concerned too much all the time about whether or not there's evidence for this, evidence for that, because the history has preserved for us these schools, and Allah has told us to follow those people of knowledge. And trying to understand the fiqh of Imam Malik, one should be concerned about understanding what fiqh is itself. And but who can tell me what is fiqh? What is it?
The laws of how to do wudu.
Laws how to do wudu.
Well, the laws of how to perform your actions. How to perform your actions.
Okay. What else?
The interpretation of the Sharia.
Interpretation of Sharia. Also, what about interpretation about how Allah exists, about His angels, and right. So Sharia, when Sharia, you mean like the laws, right?
Yeah.
Like what we do, how we practice. Or you talking about the beliefs?
No.
Okay. All right. This is your point. What else?
Understanding the religion.
Understanding
the religion.
Understanding the religion.
Oh, the religion. Understanding the religion, right? That was what the Prophet ﷺ said. Whoever Allah desires good for, He give him fiqh in the religion. But fiqh in that hadith doesn't mean fiqh as we understand it here. Fiqh in the hadith, the Prophet in his dialect, or in his language, in the language of the Arabs in general, prior to the development of the science of fiqh. Fiqh just meant understanding the knowledge. Whoever Allah desires good for, He will give them knowledge of the religion. He give them understanding of the religion. So that includes creed, practice, spirituality, all of those things. And so what about like just the things that people are always arguing about? What about like stuff about whether or not Allah has a hand and things like that? Is that fiqh?
It's aqidah.
It's aqidah. Okay, it's aqidah. You agree?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Anybody disagree? Okay, all right. I just want to be clear about that, because a lot of people think that that's what fiqh is, and so I've had experience with people who were like, well, they're teaching fiqh, I'm not going anywhere near there. No, that's the stuff they're always arguing about. Anything you argue about is fiqh. We don't want any of that stuff here. None of that stuff we got arguments about. But Imam Shafi'i has this standard definition of fiqh. And fiqh is translated, his definition translates as The fiqh is knowledge of the scriptural judgments related to human actions acquired from their specific proofs. So knowledge of the scriptural judgments related to human actions acquired from their specific proofs, which means that every action that we do has a particular classification given to it, and so to have the knowledge of that particular classification that corresponds to that particular action is, so for instance, to say intention is compulsory in wudu. So for wudu, intention is compulsory. So what is wudu for salat? Wudu for salat is a condition. It's compulsory. So if I know about what wudu is, and I know the ruling of wudu for salat, then I know mas'ala fiqhiyya. This is called a matter related to fiqh. And so when you learn a lot of those, or you learn a substantial number of them in all the different chapters of fiqh, eventually people call you faqih. You're faqih. You have knowledge of the judgment and the action, or an action and the judgment that corresponds to it. So, for instance, we learned that there are 5 basic classifications to actions. We have what's called haram. We all know what haram means. What? Forbidden. What else does it mean? What else does it mean? Impermissible. But what does that? I mean, how do we internalize that? What does that mean as a believer? How does that? It's bad. And how does it affect us? That knowledge. What does it lead us to do? Yeah, it's harmful to stay away from it. Why? But why we stay away from it? Because if we do it, then what happens?
God is displeased with me.
Huh?
God is displeased with me.
Yeah, God's displeased with me. And if He's displeased with me, then that might mean what?
Punishment.
Right, exactly. Subject to punishment. So haram is just not like you can't do it. Haram is if you do it, you're subjected to punishment. But if you don't do it, you get reward. Right? So that's what haram is. That's what it means for us. So you do it, you get punished, or you subject yourself to punishment. And if you abandon it, you get rewarded. You get rewarded. So somebody gives you, hey, take a glass of wine. They say, no. You're rewarded for it. For rejecting the act, you see. So haram is one classification. Wajib or fard is the second, which means all of us know what that is, right? Fard is obligatory. And obligatory, okay, a little bit more. And that knowledge that is obligatory leads us to do what?
Action.
Yeah, it leads us to do what? If it's obligatory, it leads us to do what?
Good deed.
To do it, right? To do it, and to do it believing that it is a duty to do it, and if that is the case, that it's a duty and we carry it out with the right intention, then we get reward for doing it. And if we abandon it, a duty, then we are subjected to punishment, right? ما يعاقب على تركه ويثاب على فعله. So if you don't do it, subjected to punishment. If you do it, you get reward. That's what fard is in a general sense. And there's some sub-classifications of it. You find differences between the Hanafis and the other scholars who say fard and wajib. There's a distinction between the two. We'll worry about that. But that's the second. So haram, wajib. Then we have what's called mandub. And mandub is what some also call sunnah, which means what? That it is something supererogatory or recommended, right? So it's favorable, it's recommended. And if something's recommended, you get reward for doing it, right? But what if you don't do it?
You get punished.
You get punished?
No.
Okay, you don't get punished, right? So it's something that, there's no sin if I don't do it. But if I do it, I get rewarded for doing it. So do I have to pray 2 rakats after Maghrib? No, I don't have to. But if I do it, I get rewarded. Do I have to fast on Mondays? No. But if I do, there's a reward in doing so. So that's what we call mandub. Then after mandub is makruh, which means disliked or undesirable. And if something is undesirable, if I do it, I'm what? Am I subjected to punishment?
No, but you're rewarded for leaving it.
Right, you're not punished, right? But you're rewarded for We're rewarded for what?
For leaving.
For leaving it, for abandoning that action.
So if you keep doing it, you get punished.
Right. Well, you could. If you keep doing it and it, becomes more severe, right? Exactly. It can lead, because it can become a haram, right? It can turn into something haram. And but makruh generally is something, if you do it, there's no punishment, but if you leave it off, you get rewarded for doing so. So I'm sleepy, afraid Asr, take me a nap. Makruh. Why? Why is it disliked to sleep after Asr? Take a nap. Who would think why?
You might miss Maghrib?
You might miss Maghrib, right? Well, you might miss Isha also. Same thing. Go to sleep after Maghrib. Same thing. Makruh. Because if you sleep after Maghrib, you might miss Isha and don't wake up until after Fajr. That's all. Is it haram? No, I don't have to stay up. If I'm sleeping, I take a nap. If I wake up too late, then the Prophet said, "Man nama ala salati aw nasiyaha falyusalliha idha dhakaraha." That if you sleep past prayer, or if you forget it, then pray when you remember. My intention was to get up, but I was tired. I was sleeping, so it's better. I get rewarded if I don't get to go to sleep, perhaps, but I don't have to worry about committing a sin if I do so. And then another example is another fifth category is mubah, which is sometimes translated as permissible, sometimes translated as neutral, which means what? That it's the type of action. If you do it, there's no reward, and if you do it, there's no punishment. If you don't do it, there's no reward. If you don't do it, so either it's neutral. It's like, so if I do it. Mubah, right? Mubah, right? Yeah, okay. No reward, no punishment. Unless you tell me, oh, it's hurting my eye, and I say, well, it is. It may turn into makruh, and it might turn into haram. It's something different. So basically, the point is that we believe that every single action has a particular ruling. Everything we do has a ruling. Everything we do. I stand up, I jump up and down. I spin around in a circle. I do a backflip. If I eat something, if I run down the street, if I tap you on your back, if I pray, if I pray Hajj, if I fast Ramadan, everything has a ruling. Every single action has a ruling. And in studying from the perspective of Imam Malik and Anas, we are studying Imam Malik's interpretation of the Quran and Sunnah, you can say. There's his interpretation of Quran and Sunnah. And there's certain principles that distinguish each particular method from the other. And so Imam Malik was, as we know, is Malik ibn Anas ibn Malik Asbahi, referred to as Imam al-Dar al-Hijra, the Imam of the abode of migration. Imam Malik is believed to have, he was the Imam of his time, whose greatness is believed to have been foretold by the Prophet ﷺ. And he's one of the four Imams. In the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said that a day would come when people would beat the livers of their riding beasts or their camels in search of knowledge, and they won't find anyone more knowledgeable than the scholar of Medina. And the scholars of Imam Malik's time, they said that was him. And so it was almost a point of consensus. There was some scholars say it was another scholar, but most of them said that it was a reference to Imam Malik. So Imam Malik ibn Anas he had the virtue of being the first scholar to publish a successful hadith work, which has been preserved for us until the present day, the Muwatta. That Imam Malik was part of a contingent of scholars during his time who had responded to a request by the Khalifa Umar ibn Abdul Aziz to collect the hadith and to codify them and to classify them under the different categories of Islamic jurisprudence. Imam Malik himself was part of actually a second contingent, the initial contingent, which concerned only with gathering the hadith without being concerned too much with whether or not they were authentic, or whether or not some of them were attributed to the Prophet or attributed to the Tabi'een or to the Sahaba. All of them were mixed together, like Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri. Imam Suyuti mentions in his Alfiya that أول جامع الحديث بالأثر Ibn Shihab al-Amir له Umar, that the first of those who gathered the hadith is Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri by the command of Umar. وأول جامع للأبواب جماعة في العصر ذو اقتراب, and the first of those to gather the hadith collect the hadith and place them under the categories of jurisprudence, or to codify the hadith as a group of scholars who existed in a time which was contemporary, where they were contemporaries to one another. Kabni Jurayjin wa Hushaym al-Maliki wa Ma'warin wa Walid al-Mubariki, and such as Ibn Jurayj, Ma'mar ibn al-Rashid, Malik ibn Anas, Ibn Mu'ammarin wa Walid al-Mubariki, and Abdullah ibn Mubarak. So all these scholars, they themselves set out to codify the hadith, to place them under the different the books of jurisprudence, or the chapters of jurisprudence. Imam Malik was successful. It took him about 40 years to compile his work, and he would take it and present it to the different ulama in Medina and ask them about the hadith to ensure him that the hadith had been heard by them also. And for that reason, it was called the Muwatta, which has been treaded upon and checked against the views of the scholars. And so this had been declared to be the first, or at least we say the oldest extant work on hadith and fiqh in the history of Islam. Although there are a number of different versions of the Muwatta, and for that reason, after being included in the collections of the 6 books we call the Kutub al-Sitta, the soundest collections of hadith in the Sunni milieu, that we find that Imam Malik's book originally was included, but then later we find that it was excluded. It was excluded and replaced by the Sunan of Imam Nasa'i, and that had a lot to do with the fact that there are many different versions of the Muwatta. And Imam Malik's the Muwatta is not a book dedicated exclusively to hadith. It was a hadith book along with fiqh judgments and fatwas by Imam Malik. And whereas the scholars wanted to have a cadre of books which were dedicated solely to the narration of hadith, and so they excluded the book of Imam Malik and introduced the Sunan of Imam Nasa'i, and so then we said the 6 books after that. And also Imam Malik's the most authentic, or the particular version of the Muwatta was considered to be the final version, the final redaction of it is the one by Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi, which also is published. And then we have an English translation of Imam al-Shaybani's publication of the Muwatta too, of Imam Malik. Now Imam Malik's madhab is built upon, relies very much upon the living sunnah, the living sunnah of Medina. Scholars of old, they had different criteria for determining what is a valid sunnah. The scholars of hadith, of course, were of the view that no sunnah is valid unless it comes in the form of a report, where every claim of sunnah had to be substantiated or corroborated by a report, what we call hadith. And because of that, the term sunnah started to be equated with the word hadith, and then amongst the masses of the people too, they started to confuse between sunnah in the words of the Prophet and sunnah as being synonymous with the word hadith, which actually was the way that the scholars of hadith defined sunnah. Or they made them synonymous with one another. So when the Prophet says sunnah, he means his way, he means his behavior, his normative practices and things like that. So it relies heavily upon the living tradition. So Imam Malik said sunnah can be established by hadith and also by the living tradition of the people of Medina, which had been praised by the Prophet himself. He said that the best of generations is my generation, and those who follow them, and those who follow them. and Imam Malik was living amongst those of the third generation, and believed that the Sunnah had been preserved so very well in that particular city, because the Prophet ﷺ, when most of the legal injunctions or the judgments related to Islamic practice were revealed, they were revealed in Medina. And almost all the Sahaba during the time of the Prophet ﷺ lived in Medina. The Prophet, he lived there, and so the way that Imam Malik and even the scholars of Medina had viewed it, they viewed this issue was that if any hadith had been heard, it had to be heard in Medina, and if any sunnah was practiced, it had to be practiced in Medina. And so that was just their logic, So if a hadith came from outside of Medina, and then we checked them with the scholars of Medina and say, well, you ever see this hadith or heard this hadith before? I said, no, never heard that before. Get it out of here. that was their attitude. It was, especially if it came from Iraq, right? Where Abu Hanifa was. So it was it was some sort of, it was a bit of tribalism in a certain extent, or fanaticism about the scholars of Medina during this early period. So it was a problem where they would only accept hadith that came from Medina, and they were very suspicious of hadith that came from outside of Medina, and in particular from Iraq, because the way they saw it was like, well, Iraq was the same place where the people who came, they killed Uthman ibn Affan. They came from Iraq, they came from Basra. That's where they were, right? So, and also the Shia, they started in Iraq. The Mu'tazila, they started in Iraq. So all this sort of polemic, the Maliki polemic against the Hanafis, and so they're giving their reasons why they did not want to accept the hadith and other things from Iraq. And also we find that later on. And prior to that, Imam Shafi'i said that the most authentic book on the face of the earth after the Book of Allah is the Muwatta of Imam Malik. But that was before the Sahih of Imam al-Bukhari. But even Imam al-Bukhari has what is called the golden chain, or at least in his view. His view considered to be the strongest chain of narration. Of hadith, which is Malik from Nafi' from Ibn Umar. So Malik ibn Anas from his Shaykh Nafi', who was a free slave of Abdullah ibn Umar, and Abdullah ibn Umar relates from the Prophet ﷺ. Imam Bukhari calls that the golden chain. Any hadith with that chain is one of the strongest chain of hadith that one can have. But other scholars differed with Imam Bukhari on that. They didn't all agree about this. So some of them preferred other chains and said this is the most authentic chain. But that was Imam Bukhari's chain. But all of the scholars of hadith, they agree that the most authentic of hadith are those that originate from Medina. The scholars of hadith all say this. The most authentic, the soundest, the strongest hadiths are those that originate from Medina, and then those that come from Mecca, and then comes that come from Sham. So those are the strongest hadith in that order. So Imam Malik's madhab primarily relies upon what are called the seven fuqaha, or the seven jurors of Medina, or the seven Medinite jurors, fuqaha sab'a, and they are Sa'id ibn Musayyib, first and foremost, was the most famous of them from the Tabi'een. Sa'id ibn Musayyib is considered to be the most knowledgeable of all of the Tabi'een, by consensus of the scholars, that he was the most knowledgeable of all of them, and he was one of the fuqaha of Medina. The Urwa ibn Zubair, who is the son of Asma bint Abi Bakr, and his father was Zubair ibn Awam, who was the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ, who was the second, Al-Qasim ibn Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr as-Siddiq, and so this is the grandson of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, Al-Qasim. The fourth, Kharij ibn Zayd ibn Thabit, who was the son of Zayd ibn Thabit. Ubaydullah ibn Abdullah ibn Utbah ibn Mas'ud, who was the great-great-grandson of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Sulaiman ibn Yasar, Salim ibn Abdullah ibn Umar. And they differ about the seventh person. So some say it's Salim ibn Abdullah ibn Umar, who was the grandson of Umar ibn Khattab, or Abu Bakr ibn Abdurrahman, meaning the son of Abdurrahman ibn Auf. Abu Bakr, and then Abu Salama ibn Abdurrahman ibn Auf, who was the other son of Abdurrahman ibn Auf. So they differ about the seventh of them, but the other six are agreed upon that these are the six of the seven fuqaha of Medina. And so Imam Malik's fiqh is very much rooted in that. But also Imam Malik's fiqh is rooted in the madhab of Umar ibn al-Khattab, radiallahu anhu. Is much vetted into that madhab. And his son, Abdullah ibn Umar ibn al-Khattab, radiallahu anhuma, knowing that it is stated by the scholars that no one was stricter or more strictly adhered to the sunnah of the Prophet than Abdullah ibn Umar. That he was the strictest about the sunnah. Even he heard one time that he saw one time the Prophet had, he heard about he went down a particular road one time, and so Abdullah ibn Umar, he even went to walk down that same road that the Prophet did, just to get the barakah of the sunnah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the sources of Maliki jurisprudence are many. I'm not going to go through all of them, but we heard that Muwatta. The next most important work is called Al-Mudawwanah al-Kubra, Imam Sahnun ibn Sa'id al-Tanuhi, amongst the Egyptian scholars who died in 240 after the Hijrah. And there are a number of other sources. Some of the sources were sources that were preferred by the people of Andalus, such as the Uzbiyah of Muhammad al-Uzbi, who died in 255 after the Hijrah. And the difference between the Uzbiyah and the Mudawwanah and the other works has to do with certain opinions that are attributed to Imam Malik and the Uzbiyah. They differ than those who are attributed to Imam Malik and the other works. So you find that there were certain schools even within the Maliki school. It's and we're going to see some of those. Some of the works that are translated into English. The Risala ibn Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani, who died in 996 of the Christian era. This has been translated quite a few times. There's probably 3, 4 different or 5 different translations of this work into English. You can find one-line translations of it. The Risala ibn Abi Zayd. There's Aisha Bewley has a translation of it. There's in a Nigerian translation. There's a Moroccan translation. There's the translation of Joseph Kinney. There are a number of different translations of the Risala ibn Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani. And then there's also a translation for the book called the Al-Muqaddimah al-Izziyah by Imam Abul Hasan, which I'm trying to see where it happened. Ali ibn Muhammad ibn Khalf ibn Jibril al-Manufi al-Misri, who was the author. So Muhammad 3 times. Muhammad ibn Khalil ibn Jibril al-Manufi, who died in 1533 of the Christian era. He is also one of the works that's translated. I can't recall. I'm trying to remember who translated it. I have a digital version of it at home.
It's Nigerian translation.
It's Nigerian translation. Okay, yeah, but it's relatively good translation. And so those are 2 books that are already of the Maliki school. There's not much translated in English as far as Maliki works. We've been waiting for quite a while for Shaykh Hamza's translation of Ibn Ashur. I have my own translation of it, and I abandoned the project once I saw Shaykh Hamza was doing it. But I told him, I said, "You've taken quite a bit of time, with it." So I think that it's going to be coming out pretty soon. It'll be out this year, and that'll be another resource. And Shaykh Hamza has translated the Akhdari. But I'm not sure when that also will be out, made official. I know he's be translated and utilized it at some of the Deen intensive programs. Right, the Akhdari's text, right? The text of Imam Akhdari. And I'm in the process of translating a commentary on Imam Akhdari's text too. And so you might find some translation of the Mahsasa Khalil. So there are some works that are translated into English, but which although they're not many, they're more Hanafi materials, and Hanafi's rule, right? Hanafi's rule, and everywhere you go, the Hanafis, they're like everywhere, and it's kind of hard to compete. The Shafi'is, they try to catch up to Hanafis, but it's going to be quite difficult to catch up with the Hanafis. And the Malikis were still struggling, so alhamdulillah, as was stated earlier, I've been doing some online classes, try to give some people an opportunity to learn some more fiqh from the Maliki school. But at any rate, in time that can be hopefully remedied. There are different schools in the Maliki school itself. There are different schools. There you have the school of Medina. There's the school of Egypt. There's the school of Iraq. and there's the North African school, or the Andalusian school, which is Al-Maghrib, which includes, so it's North Africa and Andalus, in Spain, Muslim Spain. These are historic schools. They don't necessarily still exist today, but these are schools, or these are parts of the Muslim Empire that had different scholars who had contributed, or they called the mujtahids of the school, had contributed to, and at times they would differ with one another in terms of their claims of what is the standard opinion in the Maliki school. So there were those differences that did exist. So for instance, some scholars have stated that sometimes when you find the mujtahids, they're differing with one another, then the way that you determine which particular opinions are stronger is according to this particular example. So for instance, Ibn Rushd. Ibn Rushd is one of the major mujtahids of the Maliki school. So Ibn Rushd sometimes, who is Andalusian, he sometimes may be in conflict with Abdul Wahhab al-Baghdadi, who is one of the Iraqi mujtahid scholars. And also at times he may differ with Imam al-Maziri, which is one of the Egyptian scholars. So these three scholars, there's really no way necessarily to distinguish between them, except that they're typically taken to be on the same level, but when they are at differences with one another, so for instance, Ibn Rushd against Abdul Wahhab al-Baghdadi, Ibn Rushd is stronger. See? They say, well, Ibn Rushd, we take his view. His claim of this is what madhab is, we take Ibn Rushd's claim. If Abdul Wahhab al-Baghdadi is against Imam al-Maziri, Abdul Wahhab al-Baghdadi is stronger. If any of those three are in conflict with one of the other Maliki mujtahideen, then their view is given precedence to the others. So, for instance, Ibn Yunus, one of the Egyptian scholars, he may conflict with one of them. Then Ibn Yunus, his statement against Ibn Yunus, against Ibn Rushd or the other two means nothing. Imam Lakhmi, if he is in conflict with Ibn Yunus, then Imam Lakhmi, his view means nothing compared to Ibn Yunus. Then the Egyptians in general, if they differ with, if they have claims, then in terms of the hierarchy, in terms of the mujtahideen, if we find that the mujtahids of the Egyptian school are in conflict with the mujtahideen of the Medina school, the school of Medina, then those in the Egyptian school are considered to be stronger than those in the school of Medina. Even though Imam Malik is from Medina, that was his method, this method of Medina. But the Egyptian scholars historically have established themselves as having the greatest authority in the madhab itself. So, for instance, if we go back to Ibn al-Qasim, from whom Imam Sahnud ibn Sa'id took the information about al-Mudawwana, which is considered to be the main source of the Maliki school. They were Egyptians, and they took this information direct from Imam Malik, and so they codified the madhab. So the Medinites come only second, and then after the Medinites are the Maghariba, those of North Africa and Andalus, and then the Iraqis are last. So they're at the bottom. So if the Iraqis are in conflict with the people of the Maghrib or Morocco, then Moroccans are stronger. So yes.
I'm just wondering. I understand that there may be people have specific types of knowledge, and so you would give some extra weight. But wouldn't one want to actually examine the question and see who makes more sense, as opposed to where they're from necessarily?
Yeah, but this is not talking about any individual opinion, regardless. What this is talking about, what this particular, I guess you would say this, what's the word? Hierarchy, I guess you say this hierarchy is trying to establish is what particular claims of standard views in the school itself are giving greater credence. See.
And the follow-up question is, where does the Palestinian part of this fit in?
Yeah, well, there's no Palestinian school, so not in the Maliki school. So there may be Palestinian Malikis, but likely they are following the Iraqis or maybe the Medinians or Yeah, Egyptian. Right. So it all depends on who you want to include yourself amongst. You can include yourself amongst the Egyptians. The Egyptians are considered to be, so pretty close to Egypt, right? Yeah. So that's just a brief overview of the school. I wanted to give you that introduction to it, and so that you can just get a basic idea of things. But understanding that within the Maliki school, that there are certain discrepancies between preference of different opinions. So sometimes you might, for instance, find a Maliki who prays like this, and then you say, well, no, Maliki's supposed to pray like that? Say, well, he takes the opinion of a different school, you see, of that particular view. And, this means he's not a Maliki because he prays like this, or someone may do 2 salams as opposed to 1. And so you follow me that these are issues related to the region where people study. But today, then you still don't find necessarily the same dynamic of Egyptians, Medinans, Moroccans, or Andalusians, and then Iraqis. You don't find the same distinctions. So today is more so you just have to look at what people are saying, because there's no such thing a lot of time when new issues come up to say, the Maliki school says this. Where's a brand new issue? How do you know? And it's just like, well, if you apply the principles, I say, well, that's one fatwa. Another Maliki scholar may give a different fatwa on that issue. So it's kind of hard to establish what is standard in the school in the time that we're living in. And so, but you do find that probably the most tenacious regarding the traditional or classical opinions in the school, and those who are probably the most rigid, the most conservative, put it that way, are certain groups like in Mauritania, such as those from Shaykh Abdul Hajj's village, who are the most rigid and conservative Malikis. Generally speaking, some of the people that Shaykh Hamza spoke, he had studied with himself. I studied in Morocco, and Morocco is not as conservative in terms of a lot of the fiqh. And I would say that Morocco is a bit more conservative than the Egyptians. The Egyptian Malikis today of Egypt are more liberal or less conservative than even the Moroccans. Moroccans, that is not to imply that they have abandoned the school, but it's just that they have done new ijtihadat on certain issues that, although in the Maliki school and the popular views of the Maliki school were deemed to be things which may have been inappropriate or undesirable, that they've tried to reconcile things. So an example of that is in the Maliki school, it's considered to be disliked for people to do congregational Quranic recitation, to recite the Quran in congregation in unison. In Morocco, that's like regular practice. Every single masjid you go to, after Fajr, everybody's reciting Hafiz Juz in unison. After Maghrib, they're doing the same thing. Some masjids include Asr. After Asr, so Fajr, after Asr, after Maghrib, they do it. They get together up around the minbar, around the mihrab, and people recite in unison, and afterwards they do dua, and then they leave. So it's a regular practice in Morocco. They've done an ijtihad to justify that. Same thing for congregational dhikr. Dhikr in congregation is makruh. Congregational dua is also considered to be makruh in the Maliki school. And so in Mauritanians would be, some of them, in Mauritanians, like those in the village of Shaykh Abdul Hajj's village, they probably be very rigid, and they won't say, no, we're not doing that. Because this is what the madhab says. But others say, well, no, we loose up a little bit, and we're not going to be, because of certain explanations which are there. So, sorry.
Right. I've always been interested with the school of Maliki's claim that they follow the Sunnah of the Medinan people. And that seems to me a really reasonable claim why that kind of Sunnah would be the closest to what the Prophet did. My answer is, why would Imam Shafi or Imam Hanafi or the rest of the Imams differ on that point? Do they differ on that point specifically, or is it another issue of methodology or something like that?
No, that's mainly where they break with Imam Malik with regard to the arguments that the actions of what people do can be considered to be authoritative, especially something that is binding for others to follow. And Imam Shafi'i's arguments and other Shafi'i's arguments against the upholding the method of the people of Medina was a bit disingenuous and actually intentionally distorting the argument of Imam Malik. Realistically, there was a lot of tolerance during this early period, but also there was a certain amount of fanaticism that people were inclined towards during the period also, where schools in their attempts to justify their own legitimacy, they would slight and develop certain polemics against other schools and misrepresenting their arguments. So they would say, well, how can you claim that what people do has any authority? You know? But it wasn't like Imam Malik was saying the people, the general masses in the city, and what they do is proof. Imam Malik was talking about the scholars. These are the learning community. These are people of taqwa. These are people of knowledge. And if they're doing it, and all of them are doing it, and all of them are saying it, come on, man, there had to be something. There has to be something there. And so that was the argument. It's just that other schools, in particular, I found that some of the Shafi'i arguments have been to make it appear as if it was something a bit more than that. And it's similar to Imam Shafi'i's argument against Abu Hanifa in accepting what's called istihsan. And Imam Shafi'i objected to istihsan and to Abu Hanifa's adoption of it in very harsh terms, implying that Imam Abu Hanifa was doing something haram, that he was actually committing sin and doing so. And so it's famous that Imam Shafi'i said in his Risala that ليس للمجتهد أن يشرع ومن استحسن فقد شرع, that it is a mujtahid has no right to legislate, and whoever uses istihsan, does istihsan, that person has legislated. Yeah. So he is a very strong rebuke of Imam Abu Hanifa on the part of Imam Shafi'i, when in fact Imam Abu Hanifa wasn't saying that istihsan is just okay. I think it's good. Let's do this. It wasn't like just a whimsical type of judgment that I like this particular opinion and I incline towards it, so let's do it. No, it was a deliberative type of principle, that in a reflective principle where you take into account if is there interest involved that which would demand from us or warrant that we depart from what's called al-qiyas al-jari, the apparent or the apparent qiyas, and take the more subtle analogy and depart from that. So it's a bit more deliberative and reflective in the view of Imam Abu Hanifa. So there are a lot of misrepresentations of that.
But were there any kind of other than the exaggerated representations, were there kind of reasonable objections to what I see as Imam Malik's more experiential kind of by seeing directly what the people in Medina was doing? Because my impression is the later Imams, they were much more formalistic in the sense they were dealing with text rather. They dealt with people too, but they really put heavy emphasis on the hadith itself, on the formal form of the hadith, which is the isnad and the text, rather than the experience of seeing people who interact with the Prophet for generations.
Right, yeah. So a valid argument that can be made against the method of the scholars of Medina is that there's no way to ascertain that it's correct. You see, it's an argument and it makes sense, but is my point proven beyond a reasonable doubt? No. So just simply on that basis, Imam Shafi'i say, well, bye-bye, Imam Malik, I'm going to start my own school. and pretty much that's what happened. Imam Shafi'i started his own school and had his own principles, and he wrote his Risala, and then he got credit for being the first person to write about usul al-fiqh and the science of hadith. So, and then he had his old school opinions, and he had his new school, so when he was in Damascus and then he was in Egypt. So Imam Shafi'i would go on to do that. And Imam Shafi'i's intention was actually to try to unite the schools. His intention wasn't to actually invent a new school. His whole thing was try to reconcile between Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik, their opinions and what he studied with Imam Shaybani. And so he tried to create sort of a hybrid and hope that people would just come over to his school. But it turns out people are like, oh yeah, oh I like your stuff, but you know what? We still like this over here too. So then it was 3 schools after that. Yeah.
The issue of the whole reading hybrid and reconciling, but in a way, wasn't Imam Shafi'i's position not somewhere between Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik, but actually further from both?
Right, exactly, yeah.
Wasn't Imam Abu Hanifa's position there, especially when the issues of accepting a hadith mursal and the idea of looking at the amal of, let's say, the Sahaba over their narrations, kind of closer to the idea of Imam Malik?
Yeah, definitely. Right, exactly.
At least the outcome.
Right, exactly. Yes, but I think what it is that the Hanafis were a bit more rational, in their approach, and then Imam Malik was. Imam Malik was very textual. He had text, but he also used reason too. And he had a lot of textual evidence to back it up. Whereas a lot of the Fatawa Imam Abu Hanifa, there was no text, really available for people to really see to back it up. With Imam Shafi'i, thought that that there was something that was the flaw in Imam Malik's approach was in him relying upon the actions of people and what people do. And so Imam Shafi'i started to argue that nothing can be placed over the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. That if there's no hadith to support it, then you take recourse to qiyas. Yes, you can do that. But if a hadith exists, then not even the actions of the people in the city can be stronger than that. And so just like the popular view that we find amongst the what I call the neo-Hanbalis today is that a hadith can only be acceptable unless it's sahih. And that comes from Imam Shafi'i. That's Imam Shafi'i who introduced this idea when the scholars before him had a different understanding. Imam Abu Hanifa didn't say that, or let's say Imam Abu Hanifa's conditions for sahih was not the same as Imam Shafi'i talked about. Imam Shafi'i was talking about isnad, connected chain from beginning to end, and all of the narrators reliable, and so that is sahih. Imam Abu Hanifa said, "In sahih al-hadith huwa madhhabi." If the hadith is sahih, it's my method. But what did he mean by being sahih? If a hadith contradicted with what we call, or hadith had a connected chain, but the teaching of the hadith is a universal or a type of teaching that needs to be universally understood or known by people. So there's a contradiction between what you call ma ta'ammu bihi balwa and the hadith. So the hadith that says whoever touches his penis and make wudu, that hadith. So only a couple of Sahaba related to hadith, and Abu Hanifa's opinion was like, well, that is something that all of the Sahaba should have known that. That is something that every man needs to know. Well, if we only got 2 people reporting it, that's not sahih, it's weak. So he didn't act upon the hadith. So the hadith, if you touch that's like touching any other part of your body. That was Abu Hanifa's ijtihad. So the hadith is not sahih. Although according to hadith standards, or the standards of the scholars of hadith, the hadith is sahih. So that's what the difference. So basically during this time you have scholars who looked for hadith as either acceptable or unacceptable. It wasn't like sahih, hasan, da'if. It was like acceptable or unacceptable. And every acceptable hadith was not always one that had a connected chain all from beginning to end. See? So the murasil, as you mentioned, the hadith where tabi'i attributes something to the Prophet. So the Prophet said this, or he did that. Well, how do you know? You never met him. But Abu Hanifa's opinion was that if it comes from the tabi'in, it doesn't matter. We can accept it because they're trustworthy, just like the Sahaba were trustworthy. And Imam Malik was a little different. Imam Malik, he accepted them from the we call kibar tabi'in, the senior tabi'in, those who took most of their knowledge from Sahaba. So he accepted mursal hadith from those type. Imam Ahmed ibn Hanbal was like Imam Abu Hanifa pretty much. He was like, he accepted murasil. He was after Shafi'i. But Imam Shafi'i was like, no, we're not accepting mursal hadith. We're not going to accept it. It has to be connected all the way to the end. But then he makes exceptions. He does make exceptions. So for instance, he says, and this is Imam Nawawi mentions in one book in his Taqreed, he says that if a hadith is related by there are two mursal hadiths, two different chains of narration, and both of them are mursal, meaning two different tabi'ins, and they say the Prophet said or did something. And there's one hadith on the same topic which is related, but has a connected chain all the way to the end, and it mentions a Sahabi, and it differs from those other two. Then in this case, Imam Shafi'i says the two mursal hadiths are stronger than the one chain which is connected all the way to the end. So it does make an exception, and sometimes in other areas too. So it's not completely consistent there. But at any rate, that's so there are a number of different considerations involved.
Just to clarify for Sahih, so Imam Shafi'i mainly based it on chain, and the other Imams based it on just if it was a tabi'in who did it, then
they based it on chain, but also they included a hadith. They considered it acceptable, a hadith acceptable, even if sometimes it did not have a complete chain, connection in the chain.
But it didn't matter how many people were in the chain.
Right.
It was just legitimacy of that person.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and also, and again, Imam Malik would include even if there was no hadith, if there was no hadith at all. So it's like no hadith at all. Then it's like if I'm accepting statements that don't have hadith to support them at all, then I might as well be accepting hadith that don't have a complete chain. You see, it doesn't make any sense for me to make such a distinction. Yeah. Go ahead.
With respect to when he would there how. In terms of weight, juridic weight, how much weight would he ascribe to people doing something or practice compared to something that's written in a book? Like if there's two things that are conflicting, which one weighs heavier in his? Yeah,
Imam Malik, if they're conflicting, then the practice is stronger than the hadith.
Okay.
For Imam Malik, so because by having this understanding that hadith are either acceptable or unacceptable. The understanding also was that a Sahih hadith does not produce 100% certainty.
Right.
Like people today, Muslims today think Sahih, 100% certainty. No, that's not what it indicates. Unless a hadith is mutawatir. If it's mutawatir, which means that it's been transmitted in the same way that the Quran has been transmitted, then we have 100% certainty. You see, and there's an extreme minority of those hadiths. You see. But other Sahih hadith are not mutawatir, and as a result, they don't produce 100% certainty. They may 80%, sometimes 90%, maybe sometimes 70%, sometimes. You follow me? Mm-hmm. So because of that, when they were in conflict with other principles and sources of law of the different imams that they felt gave greater certainty, they say, well, this hadith gives me 70%, this gives me 75%. So go ahead. If you want the hadith, I'm taking this. And that really was the attitude. So hadith that says that you shouldn't fast on Fridays. It's in Sahih Muslim. And don't fast on Friday unless you fast the day before or a day after. Right? Okay. So Imam Malik, he said, I found the scholars in Medina fasting on Fridays. Well, siyamuhu hasan. So it's good to fast on Fridays. And so now some scholars have tried to say, well, Imam Malik didn't know the hadith. Said, well, the context of the statement indicates he did know the hadith. Mm-hmm. Because why else would he say, I found people fasting on Fridays. Right. So he knew that there was an issue with fasting on Fridays. So he said, well, I found the scholars fasting on Fridays, so siyamu hasan. So it's good to fast on Fridays.
Mm-hmm. Was there, in observing people's behavior, did he also have a means of classifying which behavior or who amongst the people of Medina are exhibiting this behavior is more solid?
The scholars themselves. You're talking about the scholars of Medina. And most of these were his teachers. Imam Malik had almost 1,000 sheikhs.
Wow.
1,000. I'm serious. He's that many people he studied with. You see, in his city. So he had all of these people in his city, and he went and got this knowledge from him, from all of these different people. You see, and so that's what he relied upon. And so, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim before Al-Fatiha. Malik, is it part of Al-Fatiha? No. I mean, do you recite it when you pray? No. Why not? Because Medina, The Prophet, no, we never heard this in Medina. In the Prophet's mosque, from the time of the Prophet up until now, nobody has been reported as starting their prayer with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Taslima wahida, one salam, assalamu alaikum, at the end of the prayer. Okay? Are there hadiths? There are a number of hadiths that say that the Prophet did it, the hadiths say the Sahaba did it. What the scholars of hadith say, every single version is weak. All of them are weak. But what the Imam Malik relied upon, he didn't say, I'm not relying on that. In Medina, this is what we do. So, it is the sunnah to give salam one time at the end of the prayer. So that's the way it worked. So.
Two quick questions. At the same time, this issue where Imam Malik, for example, like you mentioned before, the thing between Qabd and Sadr, right? Imam Malik in Muwatta, you related to the hadith about Qabd. But the mashhur of the school is Sadr, right?
Right.
So, what about?
As a hadith scholar, which Imam Malik was, he reported anything that he believes was related by a trustworthy narrator. See, but just simply because he related a hadith in his Muwatta by a narrator who is trustworthy doesn't mean that he acted upon it. He also relates in the Muwatta the hadith about the man who gave a woman an iron ring for her dowry. Or the hadith that a man who was married to a woman to teach her on the basis of teaching her some Quran. But what is Imam Malik's position? You can't give an iron ring as a dowry. Quran, you can't teach, that's not a valid dowry to teach a person Quran. But he mentions it in his Muwatta, you see. Why? Because he's looking at what? He's looking at, okay, I know, trying to think of someone from a different city, one of the Tabi'in. I'm familiar with Hassan al-Basri. I know him, for instance. Yeah, he's trustworthy. So he relates to hadith. I read he relates to hadith, but he's trustworthy. That's just about being a fair and just scholar. And anytime Imam Malik, over a period of 40 years, felt that a hadith may not have been authentic, he removed it. You see, he took it out of his book. You see.
And the other question is, can you shed some light on this saying the Qira'at Nafi is Sunnah?
It's Sunnah.
Yeah.
Well, saying it is Sunnah is to say that it is the Qira'ah of Medina.
Okay.
Because Sunnah with the Malikis, sometimes it reflects on the Sunnah of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then sometimes it's the Sunnah of the Fuqaha of Medina. So much so that you find statements like, we don't do this, لأنه يخالف Sunnah. We don't do it because it goes against the Sunnah. So he didn't act upon the hadith. So the hadith, you touch that's like touching any other part of your body. That was Abu Hanifa's ijtihad. So the hadith is not sahih. Although according to hadith standards, or the standards of the scholars of hadith, the hadith is sahih. So that's what the difference. So basically during this time you have scholars who look for hadith as either acceptable or unacceptable. It wasn't like Sahih, Hasan, Da'if. It was like acceptable, unacceptable. And every acceptable hadith was not always one that had a connected chain all from beginning to end. See? So the Murasil, as you mentioned, the hadith where Tabi'i attributes something to the Prophet. So the Prophet said this, or he did that. Well, how do you know? You never met him. But Abu Hanifa's opinion was that if it comes from the Tabi'in, it doesn't matter. We can accept it because they're trustworthy. Just like the Sahaba were trustworthy. And Imam Malik was a little different. Imam Malik, he accepted them from we call Kibar Tabi'in, the senior Tabi'in, those who took most of their knowledge from Sahaba. So he accepted Mursal Hadith from those type. Imam Ahmed ibn Hanbal was like Imam Abu Hanifa pretty much. He was like, he accepted Murasil. He was after Shafi'i. But Imam Shafi'i was like, no, we're not accepting Mursal Hadith. We're not going to accept it. It has to be connected all the way to the end. But then he makes exceptions. He does make exceptions. So for instance, he says, and this is Imam Nawawi mentions in one book in his Taqreed, he says that if a hadith is related by, there are two Mursal Hadiths, two different chains of narration, and both of them are mursal, meaning two different tabi'ins, and they say the Prophet said or did something. And there's one hadith on the same topic, which is related, but has a connected chain all the way to the end, and it mentions a Sahabi, and it differs from those other two. Then in this case, Imam Shafi'i says the two mursal hadiths are stronger than the one chain, which is connected all the way to the end. So it does make an exception, and sometimes in other areas too. So it's not completely consistent there. But at any rate, that's so there are a number of different considerations involved.
Just to clarify for Sahih, so Imam Shafi'i mainly based it on chain, and the other Imams based it on just if it was a tabi'in who did it, then
they based it on chain, but also they included hadith. They considered it acceptable, a hadith acceptable, even if sometimes if it did not have a complete chain, a connection in the chain.
But it didn't matter how many people were in the chain.
Right.
It was just legitimacy of that person.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And also, and again, Imam Malik would include even if there was no hadith, if there was no hadith at all. So it's like no hadith at all. Then it's like if I'm accepting statements that don't have a hadith to support them at all, then I might as well be accepting hadith that don't have a complete chain. You see, it doesn't make any sense for me to make such a distinction. Yeah. Go ahead.
With respect to how. In terms of weight, juridic weight, how much weight would you ascribe to people doing something or practice compared to something that's written in a book? Like if there's two things that aren't conflicting, which one weighs heavier in his? Yeah,
but Malik, if they're conflicting, then the practice is stronger than the hadith.
Okay.
For Imam Malik. So because by having this understanding that hadith are either acceptable or unacceptable. The understanding also was that a Sahih hadith does not produce 100% certainty.
Right.
Like people today, Muslims today think Sahih, 100% certainty. No, that's not what it indicates. Unless a hadith is mutawatir. If it's mutawatir, which means that it's been transmitted in the same way that the Quran has been transmitted, then we have 100% certainty. You see, and there's an extreme minority of those hadiths. You see. But other Sahih hadiths are not mutawatir, and as a result, they don't produce 100% certainty. They may 80%, sometimes 90%, maybe sometimes 70%, sometimes. You follow me? So because of that, when they were in conflict with other principles and sources of law of the different imams that they felt gave greater certainty, they say, well, this hadith gives me 70%, this gives me 75%. So go ahead. If you want the hadith, I'm taking this. And that really was the attitude. So hadith that says that you shouldn't fast on Fridays. It's in Sahih Muslim. And don't fast on Friday unless you fast the day before or a day after. Right? Okay. So Imam Malik, he said, I found the scholars in Medina fasting on Fridays. Well, Siyamuhu Hasan. So it's good to fast on Fridays. And so now some scholars have tried to say, well, Imam Malik didn't know the hadith. Said, well, the context of the statement indicates he did know the hadith. Because why else would he say, I found people fasting on Fridays.
Right.
So he knew that there was an issue with fasting on Fridays. So he said, well, I found the scholars fasting on Fridays, so Siyamu wa Hasan. So it's good to fast on Fridays.
Was there, in observing people's behavior, did he also have like a means of classifying like which behavior or who amongst the people of Medina are exhibiting this behavior is more solid?
The scholars themselves. You're talking about the scholars of Medina. And most of these were his teachers. Imam Malik had almost like 1,000 sheikhs.
Wow.
Like 1,000. I'm serious. He's that many people he studied with. You see, in his city. So he had all of these people in this city, and he went and got this knowledge from him, from all of these different people. You see, and so that's what he relied upon. And so, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim before Al-Fatiha. Malik, is it part of Fatiha? No. I mean, do you recite it when you pray? No. Why not? Because Medina, the Prophet. No, we never heard this in Medina. In the Prophet's mosque, from the time of the Prophet up until now, nobody has been reported as starting their prayer with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. taslima wahida, one salam, assalamu alaikum, at the end of the prayer. Okay, are there hadiths? There are a number of hadiths that say that the Prophet did it, the hadiths say the Sahaba did it. What the scholars of hadith say, every single version is weak. All of them are weak. But what the Imam Malik relied upon, he didn't say, I'm not relying on that. In Medina, this is what we do. So, it is the sunnah to give salam one time at the end of the prayer. Yeah. So that's the way it worked. So.
Two quick questions. At the same time, this issue where Imam Malik, for example, like you mentioned before, the thing between qabd and sadr, right? Imam Malik in Muwatta related to the hadith about qabd. The mashhur of the school is sadr, right?
Right.
So what about?
As a hadith scholar, is what Imam Malik was, he reported anything that he believes was related by a trustworthy narrator. See, but just simply because he related a hadith in his Muwatta by a narrator who is trustworthy doesn't mean that he acted upon it. He also relates in the Muwatta the hadith about the man who gave a woman an iron ring for her dowry. Or the hadith that a man who was married to a woman to teach her on the basis of teaching her some Quran. But what is Imam Malik's position? You can't give an iron ring as a dowry. Quran, you can't teach, that's not a valid dowry to teach a person Quran. But he mentions it in his Muwatta, you see. Why? Because he's looking at what? He's looking at, okay, I know, trying to think of someone from a different city, one of the Tabi'in. I'm familiar with Hassan al-Basri, I know him, for instance, Yeah, he's trustworthy, so he relates to hadith. I read he relates to hadith. But he's trustworthy. That's just about being a fair and just scholar. And anytime Imam Malik, over a period of 40 years, felt that a hadith may not have been authentic, he removed it. You see, he took it out of his book. You see.
And the other question is, can you shed some light on this saying the qira'at nafi is sunnah?
It's sunnah.
Yeah.
Well, saying it is sunnah is to say that it is the qira'ah of Medina.
Okay.
Because sunnah with the Malikis, sometimes it reflects on the sunnah of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and sometimes it's the sunnah of the fuqaha of Medina. So much so that you find statements like, we don't do this, لأنه يخالف sunnah. We don't do it because it goes against the sunnah. They don't mean the sunnah of the Prophet, they mean the sunnah of the people of Medina. You see, right, exactly. So that's what they mean sometimes too, by that, and quite often, and then all throughout the Muwatta talked about Amr الذي لا اختلاف لنا فيه, the matter upon which there is no discrepancy amongst us in this regard is such and such. This is the matter I found the people upon in our city. This is what we've agreed upon, and so all throughout Muwatta, and he's talking about Medina specifically, and for this reason, many of the early Maliki Usulis took the view or tried to argue for the authority of the actions of the scholar of Medina by claiming that it is a form of ijma'. That is, ijma' is consensus, and everybody else is obliged to accept it. This is the early fuqaha, like Ibn al-Qassar, one of the early Maliki fuqaha, and then others will argue that it's a form of tawatur, that is a form of indisputable authenticity that had been transmitted from the early period. Although there are other scholars, they disputed it naturally. Yes.
I don't know if this is related or not, but in terms of this discussion, but so Imam Malik, you said also just look at Medina people, right? But what about the hadiths in the time of the Prophet when he was in Mecca? All those hadiths are not considered in the Maliki school, is that right?
Yeah, they are, because they came with the Prophet to Medina. It's like they weren't left there, it's like they came with them.
I know. But I mean, didn't he practice differently in Mecca and Medina?
Yeah, he did, but the reports about what he said, they still followed him, you see. And if he could ask, he would repeat it, you see, in Medina. At least that's the argument.
Okay.
Yeah.
this is a little bit off the topic of this, but I was just wondering, do you think, or what's the opinion on one, like in order for one to be a true scholar of the Islamic sciences, one has to speak and understand, have a good working knowledge of the Fusha Arabic language. Is that something that you feel is true? Or?
Well, can a person be a true scholar of Islam if they don't know the Quran, or can't read the Quran, or can't interpret the Quran? So, if you can't be, realistically, you can't consider yourself, how can you consider yourself to be a scholar of Islam if you can't read the Quran or translate it or interpret it? Then if you don't have the Arabic language, then you're not really, now you can learn a lot of stuff naturally, in the translated words about history and, and you can understand a lot of things about fiqh and things like that, but you won't be able to give fatwa or to interpret the book or to determine if the translation was correct that you read, to understand the nuances of the different possibilities of meaning in translation of certain words. So I don't see how it's possible for a person to be considered a scholar of Islam if they're not able to access the original source, the main source book of the Muslims.
So I guess my follow-up is, in North America, there are many people who, whether they hold themselves up or are held up by others as scholars of Islam, who do not speak Fusha Arabic, or really for any intents and purposes haven't really studied, who have not really studied Islam in any real depth, to be honest. Like someone read a book and they give a fatwa or whatever. What do we, first of all, how can we, to me as someone who's a layperson who has no knowledge, how can I differentiate? And second of all, is that even something that they should or could be doing in our context?
Imam Ali, radiallahu anhu, karram Allah, he said that لا تعرف الحق بالرجال, that don't know the truth by men, بل اعرف الحق تعرف أهله. Rather, know the truth and you'll know those who have it. So the best way to secure yourself and to know whether or not someone knows what they're talking about is for you to learn, and for you to learn. That's the only that's the only way. Well, put it like this. We know what the sources of Islam are, right? Okay, if we know what the sources of Islam are, we know that the original language of the Islamic sources is Arabic, right? So that means that we can learn the language first and foremost. That's the first thing, is that you have to get the keys to open up that world of knowledge of the Islamic sciences. And so that is the key, first and foremost. So regardless of who you're learning from, that if you are if you're seeking scholarship yourself, then that is the first thing you need to have. You have to have the key to the sciences. You can't have the key without having the language. And then once you study the different sciences, every particular science has its own nomenclature too. So that's usually the first thing that you study. Science of hadith has a nomenclature, fiqh has a nomenclature, tafsir has a nomenclature, usul al-fiqh. All of the different sciences have this, and so when you get the language, and then after that, it's the details that come, and just with time, with reading and so on, and with studying, sort of trying to overcome whatever other challenges that appear to you after that, and most importantly, sincerity. Yeah, most importantly is that sincerity. I believe that the Quran says, وَمَنْ يُؤْمِنْ بِاللَّهِ يَهْدِي قَلْبَهُ, that whoever believes in Allah, He will guide his heart. If you truly believe in Allah, He will guide your heart. So you have to remain sincerity. Remain sincere. وَمَا أُمِرُوا إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ. That they've only been ordered to worship God while being sincere to Him in religion. حُنَفَاء, and inclining away from idolatry. وَيُقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَيُؤْتُوا الزَّكَاةَ, and establish the prayer and the zakah. All those other qualifications are important too. And quite often when we quote that, we forget about those other parts too, because a person may say, well, I'm being sincere to Allah in religion, but he's not making salat, not paying zakat, and not inclining away from idolatry. And of course, naturally, we don't mean bowing down to an idol. You're talking about not allowing the images of others to make a serious impression upon your heart, such that you inadvertently ascribe divinity to people. And it can happen easily because of all the iconography, all the imagery. We see people's faces everywhere. Oh man, the Shaykh, it's like, we start to think, oh man, if the Shaykh said it, so it's got to be true. And so we start again, Ali, la ta'rifu al-haqq bil-rijal, don't know truth by men. It's true because so and so said it, and I trust so and so. Well, but I don't trust so and so, so I don't accept it. So what did you say then? So that's why we just have to continue to try to be sincere and just continue to study the religion, in particular the Arabic language, and then all the other sciences that relate to that afterwards, inshallah. Okay,
Imam Malik's definition of ijma. What is that?
Imam Malik's definition of ijma, or his conception of ijma, is as the majority of scholars, which is the agreement of the mujtahideen upon a judgment related to a new occurrence. Although that he would include the ijma of the people of Medina as a form of ijma, or apparently people have interpreted it that way. The Imam Malik considers that, but there are statements where Imam Malik had expressed it as the other scholars of the different schools, is that ijma it is the agreement of all of the mujtahideen or ahl al-halli wal-aqd upon a particular judgment concerning a particular occurrence. So.
But when he refers to ijma, is he going to be talking about an ijma between the Sahaba?
And the Muwatta, he's talking about the ijma of the scholars of Medina. Right.
Whether that's Sahaba or the Tabi'in.
Right, yeah. And if he's talking about Sahaba or others, he specified. He's talking about them, you see, usually. And in the Maliki school, usually when we say the Salaf are not the first three generations. In the Maliki school, typically, the Salaf are usually a reference to the Sahaba themselves in the Maliki school. And that's different from what a lot of other people understand about that. Yeah? Anything? Anything else? Okay. All right, thank you. Appreciate it. Jazakumullah khair. So maybe we'll see some of you tomorrow morning, inshallah. Wa sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Muhammadin wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه الأخيار وسلم تسليما كثيرا سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون سلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم.